In the late autumn of 1919, in Montana's Bitterroot Valley, anyone riding past the McLeod plot saw a peculiar sight. A woman, alone, building a house around her house. It looked like madness. The small, respectable cabin she'd finished just months before was being swallowed by a second, larger wooden frame. And in the 2-foot gap between the old wall and the new, Elspeth McLeod was meticulously, stubbornly stacking bales of hay. The valley had seen strange things, but this was different. This felt like a public monument to foolishness. Neighbors slowed their wagons, shaking their heads. They thought she'd lost her mind to grief or loneliness. Hay was for horses and cattle. Hay was for bedding down livestock against the coming freeze. You didn't build a house out of it. And when the winter of 1920 hit with a fury that would be spoken of for generations, that crazy hay-packed house would prove the difference between survival and surrender. If you want to hear the number that made the most experienced builders in the state go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet woman, a newcomer from a world away, understand about heat and cold that an entire community of seasoned frontiersmen had missed? Let's get into it. And as we do, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Subscribe if you believe in the power of quiet competence. Elspeth McLeod wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. She was a 34-year-old widow trying to keep her 7-year-old son, Jamie, from shivering through another winter. She had arrived in the valley 2 years prior, following a husband who had chased the promise of cheap land and found only a patch of rocky soil and a fatal bout of influenza. She was an outsider in every sense. Her accent was thick, a soft, lilting cadence from the Orkney Islands of Scotland, a place of wind, stone, and sea. Her cabin, by frontier standards, was more than respectable. She'd built it with the help of her brother, Thomas, who farmed a larger plot a few miles down the road. It was solid, tightly joined pine logs, a fieldstone fireplace, a well-pitched roof. It looked just like every other cabin in the valley, and that was the problem. Her first winter had been a brutal lesson in thermodynamics. The Montana cold wasn't like the damp chill of the North Sea she knew. This was a dry, invasive, predatory cold. It found every crack. It seeped through the very wood of the walls. She burned through 5 cords of wood, a staggering amount for such a small structure. She fed the stove every few hours, day and night, a constant, exhausting battle. Still, she woke every morning to find a skin of ice on the water bucket inside the cabin. Her son Jamie slept in his coat, his hat, and under 3 heavy wool blankets, and still he was always cold. He had a persistent, rattling cough from November until April. She stuffed rags along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff by morning, brittle as glass. The wind was the real enemy. She'd watch from her window as it scoured the valley, bending the pines and whipping snow into blinding sheets. And she began to understand something fundamental. Wind doesn't just chill the air. At 40 miles per hour, it strips heat directly from the solid wood of the walls. It was like living inside a bucket while someone relentlessly poured unimaginable cold over the outside. The fire in her stove wasn't heating the cabin. It was just fighting a losing war against the heat being stolen, second by second, through the walls themselves. One evening, staring into the fire, a memory surfaced. Her father. He was a stonemason back in Orkney, a man of few words and strong hands. He worked on restoring ancient structures, castles, cairns, and the mysterious stone towers they called brocks. She remembered him tapping a massive wall, 2,000 years old. "See, lass," he'd said, his voice rough as the stone itself. "It's two walls, an outer and an inner, and the space between is filled with rubble and earth. That's the secret, not the stone. The space, the thickness. It holds the day's heat right through the night." The thought nagged at her. Thickness, not just a single barrier against the cold, but a deep, massive buffer. Her log cabin was a single shield. It wasn't enough. The wind broke through it. What if she built a second shield, an outer wall? And what if she filled the space between not with rubble, but with something that held air, something light, cheap, and plentiful? Her plan formed. It was simple in concept, but absurd to the eye. She would build a second, non-structural frame around her entire cabin, leaving a 2-foot gap. She would sheath it on the outside, and she would fill that cavity from the foundation to the eaves with the best insulator she could find for almost no money at all. Hey, her brother Thomas ran a successful farm. He had stacks of hay, some of it years old, the bottom bales compressed, dry, and not worth much as feed. When she approached him with her plan, he looked at her with deep, familial concern. "Elspeth, you can't be serious," he said, his voice gentle. "It's a fire hazard. It'll draw every mouse and rat in the county. It will rot. The moisture from the house will get in. The snow will melt against it. It'll be a soggy, useless mess by January." "It will stay dry," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "How?" "I'll build it correctly." He sold her 50 bales of his oldest, driest hay for a pittance, convinced he was humoring a grieving sister's strange project. He thought it was a harmless, if wasteful, way for her to keep busy. He didn't understand that for Elspeth, this wasn't a project. It was a calculation for survival. The build began in September. She sourced her materials with frugal precision. The lumber for the outer frame came from a small local mill, rough-cut and cheap. She paid for it by mending clothes for the mill owner's family. The total cost for the wood was under $40. The hay had cost her $5. Nails and hardware were another $10. The work was slow and methodical. She first dug a trench around her cabin's foundation, about a foot deep, and filled it with coarse gravel. This was critical. It was a capillary break, designed to stop ground moisture from wicking up into the hay. Her father had taught her that. "A stone house with wet feet is a cold house," he used to say. Then she erected the second frame, a simple post and beam construction, standing 2 feet out from her existing log walls. It looked skeletal, like the ghost of a larger barn rising around her home. This was the part that drew the first stares from the road. Once the frame was up, she began sheathing the outside with rough pine boards, but she didn't nail them tight against each other. She left a tiny 1/4-inch gap between each board. This was another critical detail, one that everyone else missed. They saw it as sloppy construction. She saw it as essential physics. The wall needed to breathe. Any moisture that found its way into the hay had to have a way to escape outwards. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. She was building something that today's building scientists would call a vapor open assembly. She was decades ahead of her time, working entirely from first principles and inherited wisdom. With the outer shell complete, the real work began. She started bringing the hay bales from her brother's farm, one by one, in a small handcart. Each bale was dense, heavy, and smelled of dry summer sun. She lowered the first layer into the cavity, fitting them tightly against each other, stuffing any small gaps with loose hay. Then the second layer, staggering the joints like bricks. The process was grueling. It was a one-woman assembly line. Lower the bale, position it, pack it tight, repeat. Her son Jamie, small for his age, would bring her water and watch with a child's unquestioning loyalty. Her brother Thomas stopped by one afternoon, watching her wrestle a bale into place. "Elspeth, it's not too late to stop this," he urged. "Silas Blackwood was by my place. He said people are talking. They think you're building a fire trap." "A fire needs air, Thomas," she said, not pausing in her work. "This hay is packed so tight a mouse couldn't breathe in it." She was right. Densely packed straw or hay is surprisingly fire-resistant. It's loose, airy hay that ignites in a flash. She insulated right up to the roofline, creating a continuous thermal blanket 2 feet thick around the entire living space. She built a small ventilated attic space above the cabin ceiling, also packed with loose hay, ensuring the buffer was complete. The final result was bizarre. From the outside, it looked like a plain, rough-sawn wooden box, slightly oversized for its windows. A barn that had swallowed a house. There was no visible sign of the strangeness within. Total cost for the entire retrofit, under $60. The 50 bales of hay, the lumber, the hardware, less than the cost of 2 cords of firewood. As she drove the final nail, her brother visited again. His face was etched with worry. "Elspeth," he said, his voice low, "people are going to think we've lost our minds. They're going to think I let you do this." "Let them," she replied, wiping sweat from her brow. She looked at her finished work, not with pride, but with a grim sense of preparedness. And when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw eccentricity. They saw a woman unmoored by grief. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with professional concern. Calvin Dreeker, who ran the sawmill and had built half the cabins in the valley, made a special trip. He was a man whose identity was tied to his competence. He walked around the structure, tapping the walls, his brow furrowed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "I don't mean to pry, but this design, I've never seen its like." "It's just an outer wall," Elspeth said simply. "Filled with hay," Drecker countered. "That hay is going to collect moisture. Every bit of steam from your kettle, every breath you take, some of that moisture is going to find its way into your walls. In a normal cabin, it freezes and thaws. In this, it's going to hit that hay. It'll get damp. It'll start to compost. You'll have mold, rot. The whole wall cavity will turn into a useless, sagging mess by spring. You're rotting your house from the inside out." It was a perfectly reasonable, technically sound objection based on everything he knew. "I've allowed for it to dry," was all Elspeth said. Drecker shook his head slowly. "I hope you're right, ma'am, for your boy's sake." He left, convinced he had just witnessed a well-intentioned catastrophe in the making. The public mockery was less polite. It happened at the general store. Jedediah Croft, a tough, loud rancher known for his blunt talk, saw Thomas loading sacks of flour. "Hey, Thomas!" he boomed, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "I hear your sister's building a new kind of house, one where she lives inside and the cows live in the walls." A few men snickered. Thomas's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He said nothing, paid for his goods, and left. The nickname stuck. For the rest of that autumn, the McLeod place was known as the Hay Barn. The gossip network buzzed. At the church social, women would ask Thomas's wife, Mary, in hushed, concerned tones if poor Elspeth was feeling all right. The quilting circle dissected the foolishness of it, clucking their tongues. Such a shame, and with that young boy to raise. It was a suffocating blanket of pity and condescension. Writers would go out of their way to pass by the cabin, slowing down to stare at the strange, blank-walled structure. Then came the institutional skeptic. Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent, arrived one afternoon in his Ford Model T. He was a man who lived by government pamphlets and agricultural science. He carried a clipboard and had a perpetually worried expression. "Mrs. McLeod," he began, peering at the house over his spectacles, "I've received some reports about your unique insulation method." "It's hay," she said. "Indeed," he nodded, making a note. "Now, our bulletins are very clear on this. Hay storage requires significant ventilation to prevent spoilage and, in large stacks, spontaneous combustion. Furthermore, it provides an ideal habitat for vermin. We have documented cases of hayrick fires, of infestations." He saw the house not as a home, but as a violation of established agricultural practice. "This isn't in any manual I've ever seen." "It's not a hayrick, Mr. Abernathy. It's a wall," she said, her patience wearing thin. He left, promising to return for a follow-up inspection and shaking his head at the stubborn ignorance of homesteaders. But the cut that went deepest came from her brother, Thomas. He came over one evening in late November, the air sharp with the promise of real cold. He found her splitting firewood, her movements efficient and strong. "They're laughing, Elspeth," he said, his voice strained. "At the feed store, at church. They're not just whispering. They're laughing. Jedediah Croft is calling you the Hay Queen of the Bitterroot." He paused, the next words costing him. "People are going to think you're either scared or incompetent, that you don't know how to manage a proper cabin, so you built this thing. They think you're putting Jamie in danger." Elspeth stopped, leaning on the axe. She looked her brother in the eye. Her voice was level, without a trace of anger or self-pity. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas. I'm trying to keep my boy warm." By December, not one person in the valley thought Elspeth McLeod had solved anything. They thought she had built a monument to her own folly, a wooden tombstone for common sense. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Elspeth right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then January came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1920 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives as one of the most severe in the 20th century. It wasn't just a storm, it was a siege. A vast, brutal mass of Arctic air descended from Canada and settled over the northern Rockies, and it did not move. The temperature escalation was relentless. January 5th, the thermometer at the general store read minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. January 8th, minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. By January 10th, it was minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and a vicious wind started blowing out of the northeast, driving wind chills down to minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit and below. For 16 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never climbed above 0. The snow came with the wind, fine and sharp as sand. It didn't fall so much as it flew horizontally, scouring the landscape and burying everything in its path. Drifts piled up 10, 15 feet high. Roads disappeared. The valley was cut off, each homestead an isolated island in a sea of white. This was the kind of cold that breaks things. It breaks machinery, it breaks livestock, and it breaks people. The community began to suffer. The suffering was specific and measurable. Calvin Drecker, the master builder, found his own well-built house struggling. The seasoned wood he'd set aside was running low, and he was forced to burn greener pine. It sizzled and smoked, producing more creosote than heat. His chimney clogged twice. He spent a terrifying afternoon on his frozen roof in a blizzard, chipping it clear. Inside, his family lived in one room, huddled around the stove, wearing every layer they owned. The house held 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and it took a mountain of wood to do it. Jedediah Croft, the rancher who had mocked Elspeth, was fighting for his herd. He lost a dozen head of cattle in the first week, frozen solid in the fields. The rest he crowded into his barn, but the barn itself was an icebox. He and his ranch hands worked in shifts, keeping fires going in metal barrels, just to keep the animals alive. They were burning fence posts by the second week. Thomas, Elspeth's brother, had one of the best-built farmhouses in the area. Double-planked walls, a big stone fireplace, and a new cast-iron stove. He was burning through his massive woodpile at an alarming rate, nearly a cord a week. Still, the temperature inside his spacious home hovered around 50 degrees. His wife Mary and their children were constantly cold. The windows were opaque with thick frost, not on the outside, but on the inside. Across the valley, the story was the same. Families were desperate. Woodpiles vanished. People started burning furniture. Children got sick. The cold was a physical presence, an enemy that was inside the houses, winning the war for warmth room by room. And then people started noticing the McLeod place, or rather, the lack of anything to notice. A neighbor, struggling through the drifts to check on his traps, passed by her property. He was expecting to see a house buried in snow, with smoke pouring from the chimney, a sign of a desperate fire burning within. Instead, he saw something strange. The cabin was clear of drifts on the leeward side, and from the chimney rose only the thinnest, most delicate wisp of pale blue smoke. It wasn't the frantic plume of a stove being fed constantly. It was the lazy, placid smoke of a slow, steady fire. As he got closer, he stopped, stunned. Through the window, which was perfectly clear of frost, he could see Elspeth sitting at her table, reading a book to her son. She was wearing a simple wool dress, not a coat, not a shawl, a dress. The sight was so profoundly wrong, so out of step with the brutal reality of the freeze, that he thought he was imagining it. He hurried home, the image burned into his mind. Stay with me, because the number that came out of that cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It defied the known laws of their world. On the morning of January 12th, the coldest day of the siege, Thomas could stand it no longer. The temperature at his farm was minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill. He was consumed with a terrible, gnawing guilt. He had let his sister build that madhouse. She and Jamie were all alone. They must be out of wood. They must be freezing. For all he knew, they could be dead. He loaded a sled with as much split dry oak as he could manage, precious fuel he couldn't really spare, and harnessed his strongest horse. The journey of a few miles took him nearly 2 hours, fighting through immense drifts and blinding wind. When he finally reached her clearing, he saw the same thing the trapper had seen, the impossibly thin wisp of smoke. He stumbled to the door, his beard a mask of ice, and pounded on it with a gloved fist. "Elspeth, it's Thomas. Are you all right?" The door opened. The warmth hit him first. It wasn't the scorching, localized heat of an overstoked stove. It was a gentle, pervasive, impossible warmth. It was like stepping from the Arctic into a mild autumn afternoon. And then he saw her. Elspeth stood in the doorway, wearing a simple cotton shirt and trousers. Her sleeves were rolled up. Behind her, through the cabin opening, Thomas saw his nephew, Jamie. The boy was on the floor, playing with a set of carved wooden animals. He was in his shirt sleeves. Not coats, not blankets, shirt sleeves. The air in the cabin was calm and still. There was no frantic energy of survival, only a deep, abiding peace. Thomas stared, speechless. He was so layered in wool and canvas he could barely move, and here they were, dressed for spring. "Thomas, are you all right?" Elspeth's voice broke through his shock. "You look frozen solid. Come in." "The wood," he stammered, gesturing to the sled. "I thought you'd be out." She glanced at the sled, then at her wood box by the stove. It was a simple box, and it was still more than 3/4 full. "That's kind of you," she said, "but we're managing fine." "Managing?" he croaked, stepping inside and shutting the door against the howling wind. The sudden silence was as shocking as the warmth. "Elspeth, people are burning half a cord a week just to stay above freezing. How much are you burning?" "Oh, a few small logs in the morning to cook breakfast," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "And a few more in the evening, perhaps a dozen logs a day, all told." The number was so small, so utterly unbelievable, that Thomas's mind couldn't process it. A dozen logs a day. He was burning 200. He looked around the single room. It was bright, comfortable. A pot of soup simmered on the stove, adding a gentle humidity to the air. His eyes fell on the wall thermometer, an old mercury one he had given her. He walked over to it, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The mercury sat clearly, steadily, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 68 degrees, while the world outside was 42 degrees below zero. A temperature difference of 110 degrees. This was the impossible number. It wasn't just better than his farmhouse. It wasn't an incremental improvement. It was a categorical leap into a different reality. He reached out and touched the interior log wall next to the thermometer. He expected it to be frigid. It wasn't. It was cool, but not cold. It felt like the wall of a basement in summer. All the heat being produced by the small stove was staying inside the room. The 2-foot-thick barrier of hay was stopping the cold dead in its tracks. Word travels fast in a crisis. The trapper had told his story. Thomas, when he returned home, told his. The news rippled through the frozen valley, a message of something inexplicable happening at the hay barn. The next day, Calvin Drecker arrived. He didn't bring wood. He brought his tools and his skepticism. He too was met with the same shocking wave of warmth, the same sight of a child playing comfortably in a winter that was killing livestock. He didn't trust his senses. He pulled out his own pocket thermometer. It confirmed the reading. 68 degrees. He was a builder. He needed to understand the mechanics. Elspeth, Seeing his genuine professional curiosity let him inspect everything. He checked the attic space. It was cold, but the floor, which was the cabin ceiling, was packed thick with loose hay. He tapped the interior walls. Solid. He went outside, brushed snow away from the outer sheathing, and pressed his ear against it. He could hear nothing. It was inert. He understood then. The inner cabin was floating in a sea of dead, still air trapped in the hay. The relentless wind could beat against the outer wall, but its energy dissipated in the 2-foot buffer. The heat-stripping effect was gone. He came back inside, his face pale with understanding. He looked at Elspeth, then at the simple, efficient structure around him. He looked at the tiny, slow-burning fire in the stove. He thought of his own family, huddled and shivering. He thought of the houses he had built, dozens of them, all based on the same flawed principle of a single, solid barrier. He stood in the middle of the warm room for a full minute, silent. Then he spoke, his voice low and heavy with the weight of a lifetime's conviction being overturned. "I've been building houses in this valley for 30 years, he said. "I've been building them wrong." This was the true vindication. It wasn't just comfort, it was dignity. Jamie did his school work at the table without shivering. Elspeth cooked and mended in normal clothes. They slept through the night under a single blanket. The fire banked low, and woke to a cabin that was still 60 degrees. The system turned winter from something to survive into something to live through. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, was the last to arrive, a week later, when the cold snap finally broke. He brought a calibrated, scientific thermometer. He measured the interior temperature, the exterior temperature, and even drilled a small hole to measure the temperature in the middle of the hay wall. His meticulous records confirmed everything. He documented fuel consumption, comparing Elspeth's dozen logs a day to the half-quart-a-week averages elsewhere. The data was undeniable. Elspeth's hay barn was using less than 10% of the fuel of a conventional cabin, while maintaining a temperature 20 degrees warmer. The difference wasn't incremental. It was an order of magnitude. By the time the thaw came in February, half the valley knew something impossible was happening at the McLeod place. The laughter had stopped. It was replaced by a quiet, stunned respect. The mockery had been loud and public, but the vindication was quiet, warm, and irrefutable. It was measured in degrees Fahrenheit and cords of wood saved. The first convert was a young man named Miller, with a wife and a newborn baby. Their cabin was small, poorly built, and located in a windswept hollow. They had nearly frozen during the great cold, the baby sick and crying constantly. He showed up at Elspeth's door in early spring, hat in hand, his face a mixture of desperation and shame. He had been one of the men who had laughed at the trading post. "Mrs. McLeod," he said, not meeting her eye, we can't face another winter like that. Can you show me what you did?" Elspeth didn't gloat. She never once said, "I told you so." She simply took him outside and explained the principle. She didn't give him a blueprint. She gave him the theory. "A house inside a house," she said, tapping the outer wall. "The space between is what matters. Fill it with whatever you have that holds air and costs nothing. Old clothes, sawdust, corn husks, but dry hay is best. Pack it tight and build a good roof over it all. The secret is simple. Keep the hay bone dry." That summer, Miller and his brothers built a rough, ugly hay wrap around their little cabin. It wasn't as neat as Elspeth's, but it followed the principle. The next winter, which was a normal, cold Montana winter, they stayed warm for the first time, burning a fraction of the wood they had before. Their baby thrived. The idea, once proven, spread like a slow, steady fire. It wasn't a revolution, but an evolution driven by necessity. By the summer of 1921, 7 other families had built hay-wrapped additions. By the following winter, there were nearly 20 in the valley and the surrounding counties. They were called McLeod houses, or sometimes just hay wraps. Each was slightly different, adapted with whatever materials the builder had on hand. But they all worked. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, became the idea's official champion. In 1922, he published a bulletin for the State Agricultural Extension Service. It was titled An Experimental Method for Super-Insulating Farm Dwellings Using Low-Cost Agricultural Byproducts. He never named Elspeth directly, referring only to an innovative female homesteader in the Bitterroot Valley. But everyone knew. The bulletin included his temperature charts, fuel consumption data, and construction diagrams. It was distributed across the northern states, and for years, farmers and homesteaders used its principles to survive brutal winters. What Elspeth McLeod had built in 1919, using instinct and inherited wisdom anticipated by nearly half a century, what building scientists would later call the super-insulated wall assembly. It was a perfect example of low-tech, high-performance design. Years later, when she was an old woman and her son Jamie had taken over the expanded farm, a visiting journalist asked her if she felt proud of her invention. She just shook her head, a small smile on her face. "It's not new," she said, her Scottish accent now softened by decades in the valley. "It's just correct. Thick walls hold the heat. That's all there is to it." The original cabin, the core of her hay house, still stands. It's now the warm central room of a much larger ranch house, and to this day it's known as the warmest room in the valley during a cold snap. It stands as a quiet monument, not to genius, but to the power of observation, the courage to defy convention, and the simple, irrefutable laws of physics. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for their own sake. It rewarded what worked. Drop a comment. What's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? And what's one piece of old wisdom you think we've forgotten? Subscribe for more stories of quiet competence and proven frontier techniques every week. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction of frontier building techniques. The characters, names, and specific events are fictional, but the engineering principles of super-insulation and the historical use of natural materials like straw and hay for construction are based on real historical and modern practices.